The email arrived at 6:47 in the morning on the day before Thanksgiving. I was still in my pajamas standing at the kitchen counter waiting for the coffee to finish brewing when my phone buzzed against the tile. It was from my stepmother Linda, 4 sentences. No greeting, no punctuation at the end. We're keeping dinner small this year, just immediate family and a few of Richard's colleagues. It would be better if you made other plans. We'll connect after the holiday. I read it twice. Then I set the phone face down on the counter, poured my coffee, and sat down at the kitchen table. I didn't write back. I didn't call my father. I didn't text my stepsister Brooke, who I already knew had helped Linda draft that message because Linda had never used the word connect in her life. I sat there with both hands wrapped around the mug watching the steam curl upward, and I let the clarity settle over me like cold water. I had been waiting for this moment for 3 years. I opened my laptop. There's a piece of property in rural Tennessee about 40 minutes outside of Nashville that had been sitting in a quiet title dispute since my grandfather passed 2 years ago. It was 11 acres of wooded land with a small farmhouse, a detached workshop, and a spring-fed pond. My grandfather had built the workshop himself in the 1970s. He had left it to me in a handwritten addendum to his will. Linda had contested it the week after the funeral, claiming the land was marital property that should roll into my father's estate. The case had been moving through probate court at the pace of cold syrup ever since. That morning I called my attorney Meg. She picked up on the second ring. I told her I wanted to accelerate the quiet title filing. I told her I wanted it done before the holiday weekend if possible. She asked if something had happened. I told her yes. She didn't ask what. What Linda did not know, what my father had chosen not to know, was that I had spent the past 14 months quietly building a case that would have made my grandfather proud. My name is Claire. I am 31 years old. I am a certified forensic document examiner, which means I spend my professional life looking at signatures, notary stamps, and deed transfers and determining which ones are real and which ones are theatre. I had examined every document Linda had submitted to challenge my grandfather's addendum. Every single one. 2 of them had problems. The notary seal on Linda's primary exhibit had been applied using a stamp that wasn't registered in Tennessee until 8 months after the document's listed date. I had cross-referenced the stamp registration number against the state database 4 times. The second document had a signature that my grandfather had allegedly signed authorizing Linda as co-trustee of his personal property holdings. My grandfather's handwriting had a distinctive tremor in the capital R that developed after his stroke in 2019. The signature on Linda's document had no tremor. It was smooth, confident, and completely inconsistent with every authenticated sample I had collected from letters, birthday cards, and receipts dated after his stroke. Someone had signed my grandfather's name, someone who had never met him after 2019, someone who did not know about the tremor. I had submitted my findings to Meg 11 weeks ago. We had been waiting for the court date. That morning the court agreed to expedite. I closed the laptop, finished my coffee, and started packing a bag. The farmhouse had been empty since my grandfather passed. I had driven out twice to check on it, to run the water lines so they wouldn't freeze, to make sure the roof hadn't taken on any damage from the ice storms that came through last February. Each time I went I stayed only a few hours. It didn't feel right to settle in before the title was clear. But that morning felt different. I loaded my truck with enough to last 2 weeks, my work equipment, a portable monitor, my external drives, 2 bags of groceries, my grandfather's old wool blanket that I had taken from the farmhouse the day after his funeral because I knew if I left it, it would disappear. I drove south out of the city and I did not look back. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love knowing who's part of this community. The farmhouse sat at the end of a gravel road flanked by cedar trees that were old enough to remember things none of us were alive to see. When I pulled up that evening the porch light was still working. I had replaced the bulb in October. I sat in the truck for a moment with the engine off listening to the property settle into evening quiet. A creek ran somewhere behind the tree line. A woodpecker was finishing his work for the day in one of the pines along the fence. I got out of the truck and I stood in the cold and I breathed. My grandfather had always said this land had a sound to it. He said if you listened long enough, you could hear it thinking. I had thought that was old man poetry when I was 12. Standing there at 31 holding my bag and looking at the house he built with his own hands, I understood exactly what he meant. I went inside. The air smelled of cedar and dust and something underneath that I could only call him. I stood in the doorway of the workshop for a long time. His tools were still on the pegboard in the order he kept them. His coffee mug was still on the shelf above the workbench turned upside down the way he always left it after washing. I didn't move anything. I set up my workspace in the kitchen. I ran a systems check on my equipment. I reviewed the updated court filings Meg had sent while I was driving. Then I did the thing I had been planning since August. I drove to the county hardware store before it closed and I bought 2 commercial-grade deadbolts, a set of exterior motion sensor lights, a wireless camera system with 4 units, and enough screws to make a convincing argument. I spent the next morning installing all of it myself. I am not someone who talks about what I know before I need to use it. But I will say this. My grandfather taught me to use a drill before I knew how to ride a bike. I mounted those cameras at every angle that mattered. Driveway, front porch, the side gate, and the workshop entrance. I installed the deadbolts with 3-inch screws set deep into the original door frame. When the last one clicked into place, I stood back and looked at the door and felt something shift in my chest. It was a quiet, solid feeling, the feeling of a thing done correctly. The cameras fed to an app on my phone. I set up motion alerts. I called Meg and gave her the farmhouse address and told her I was in residence. She told me the court date was confirmed for the following Tuesday. She also told me that Linda's attorney had filed a last-minute motion the previous afternoon requesting an emergency injunction to prevent any change in property status before the hearing. The judge had denied it within 2 hours. I thanked Meg. I made dinner. I slept better than I had in 3 years. The silence that followed was the kind that had texture to it. My father called twice the day after Thanksgiving. I let both go to voicemail. He didn't leave messages. Brooke sent a text that said, "Just checking in on you. Hope you're okay," which was the most transparently surveillance-adjacent text I had ever received. I did not respond. I was not performing unavailability. I was simply unavailable. My days had a rhythm. I worked remotely in the mornings reviewing document submissions for a case involving a forged signature on a commercial lease in Phoenix. In the afternoons I walked the property line reacquainting myself with the land. I found the spring my grandfather had shown me when I was 7. I found the stone wall he had started building along the east boundary and never finished. I found the corner post he had carved my initials into the summer I turned 10. Just deep enough that the bark had grown around the edges of the letters like the tree was keeping them. 8 days after I arrived, the cameras picked up movement at the gate. It was 2:17 in the afternoon. I was at the kitchen table when my phone buzzed with the motion alert. I picked it up and opened the camera app. A white SUV had stopped at the gate. 2 people got out. My father was wearing his weekend coat, the tan one he wore when he wanted to appear reasonable rather than powerful. Linda was beside him in a long wool coat holding her phone. They stood at the gate for a moment and then a third car pulled up behind them. A grey sedan. A woman got out holding a leather portfolio, pressed blazer, low heels. The kind of shoes you wear when you're going somewhere you expect to be walking through a property and writing down numbers, an appraiser. They hadn't come to talk. They hadn't come to check on me. They had come to assess the property for a transaction they were planning to complete regardless of whether the title was legally theirs to transfer. I watched my father try the gate latch. It was locked. He pulled out his phone and dialed. Mine buzzed in my hand, his name on the screen. I did not answer. He called again. I watched him on camera, watching him realize I was probably inside and not responding. Watching his jaw tighten with the particular frustration of a man who has never in his life had a door closed to him that he did not eventually open. He said something to Linda. She shook her head. He said something else. She opened her portfolio. I saved the footage. Then he did the thing I had been waiting for him to do, the thing I had known with the certainty of a woman who has examined human behavior professionally for 8 years that he would do if I simply waited long enough. He went back to the SUV and pulled out bolt cutters. He cut my lock. He pushed the gate open. He walked up my driveway like he owned it because in his mind he did. That was the thing about my father, Richard. He was not a stupid man. He was a man who had spent his entire adult life in environments where his certainty was treated as authority. He had built a successful commercial real estate business on the principle that confidence is 9/10 of ownership. If you walked into a room like it was yours, it became yours. If you signed paperwork quickly and with good posture, people rarely read the fine print. He had met my grandfather once at the wedding. He had never understood that my grandfather was the origin of every instinct I had. I stood up from the kitchen table. I picked up my phone and I pressed the emergency relay I had configured the day I arrived, not to a call center, not to a recording service, directly to the county sheriff's non-emergency line, routed through a pre-arranged contact that Meg had set up with the deputy assigned to our court case. Then I walked to the back of the house and knocked twice on the workshop door. Meg opened it. She had driven down from Nashville that morning. She was staying in the back bedroom. She was holding her own phone and a black binder that she had carried into more courtrooms than I had years of experience. She looked at me. I showed her the camera feed. She looked at the screen for approximately 4 seconds, then looked back at me. "He cut the gate lock," she said. "He cut the gate lock," I confirmed. "Sure." She opened the binder. I walked back to the kitchen and I waited. They knocked. My father knocked with the authority of a man who expects the door to open, a solid, impatient knock that said he was doing me a favor by announcing himself rather than just entering. When I didn't answer, there was a pause. Then the sound of something being tried against the lock, the spare key he kept on his ring, the one he had made years ago from the farmhouse's original lock, the lock I had replaced on my second afternoon here. The key didn't fit. There was a longer pause. Voices outside. Then the distinct hollow thud of a shoulder against a door. The commercial-grade deadbolt held. I heard Linda say something sharp. I heard the appraiser say something that sounded like maybe we should and then stop mid-sentence. Then I heard the sound of wood being worked, a prying, effortful sound, and the frame around the doorknob began to splinter. What I felt in that moment was not fear, and it was not anger. What I felt was the clean, quiet click of a thing being confirmed. I had believed for 3 years that my father had participated in forging my grandfather's signature. I had the forensic evidence. I had the expert analysis. But evidence of what someone did in the past is one kind of proof. Watching them do the same category of thing in the present is another kind entirely. It is the kind that sits in a jury's memory differently. The door gave. My father stepped into the farmhouse. He scanned the room, saw me standing in the kitchen doorway, and he rearranged his face into an expression I recognized from childhood, the reasonable face, the face he used when he was about to explain to me why my version of events was missing important context. "Claire." He said my name like a period at the end of a sentence. "Richard," I said. He did not love that I had started using his first name 18 months ago. He considered it disrespectful. I considered it accurate. He began to explain that the property was in dispute, which meant neither party should be in residence unilaterally, which meant I was the one actually acting improperly here. And wasn't it interesting that I had changed the locks on a property I didn't legally own yet? Linda stood behind him with her arms crossed. The appraiser had stopped in the doorway, 1 foot in and 1 foot out, clipboard against her chest, reading the room, and clearly revising her understanding of what she had been hired to do. I let him finish. "Are you done?" I asked. He said he wasn't done, that this was exactly the kind of thing that had made these last few years so difficult, this wall I had put up, this refusal to engage with the family as a unit. Through the window, I saw headlights come up the gravel road, 2 vehicles, the sheriff's cruiser and Meg's colleague in a second car. The lights went on across the front of the property, 8 high-intensity floods I had mounted along the roofline and the fence, all triggered simultaneously by the relay. The yard went from winter dusk to high noon in an instant. My father turned toward the window, reflexively shielding his eyes. The deputy stepped out of the cruiser and walked toward the house with a particular unhurried pace of someone who already knew everything he needed to know and was simply here to complete the process. My father recovered quickly. He turned back toward the door, moving toward his reasonable face again, and he began the same story he had told for 3 years, property dispute, concern for his daughter's welfare, just checking on the estate. The deputy listened with the patience of a man who had heard this specific register of voice before, the voice of a man who believes his own explanation is a kind of currency. The deputy looked at the door frame. He looked at the splintered wood around the lock. He looked at the bolt cutters still in my father's hand, which my father had apparently forgotten he was holding. "Sir," the deputy said, "I need you to set those down." My father set them down. Meg walked out of the back hallway and stood beside me, binder open. She introduced herself to the deputy by name because she had spoken to him twice on the phone in the past week. She cited the court case number. She noted the date, time, and nature of the entry. She mentioned the gate lock, the forced door, and the presence of a third party who had been brought to the property for the apparent purpose of conducting a real estate appraisal on a property currently under quiet title proceedings. The appraiser said she had been told this was a family property and there was no dispute. Meg looked at her. "You may want to verify that with your client before proceeding." The appraiser put her clipboard under her arm and walked back to her car. Linda started talking. She talked about the handwritten addendum being informal and unenforceable. She talked about my grandfather's mental state in his final years, a claim she had made in writing, and that I had methodically dismantled over 11 months of documented medical testimony. She talked about how I had always been difficult, always competitive, always turning everything into a legal situation. I waited until she was finished. "Linda," I said, "I'd like to talk to you about the notary stamp on the co-trustee authorization document." She stopped. "The stamp number you used wasn't registered in Tennessee until March of 2021, I said. "The document is dated June of 2020. She looked at my father. "I'd also like to talk about the signature on that document," I said. "My grandfather had a tremor in his right hand after his stroke. It's visible in every authenticated piece of his handwriting from 2019 forward. The signature on your document doesn't have it. I have 47 reference samples that demonstrate the inconsistency." My father said that was a serious allegation. "It is," I agreed. "The district attorney's office thought so, too. They've had my report since last Thursday." The sound my father made was not quite a word. It was the sound of a man whose certainty had just discovered the flaw was not where he had placed his foot. The deputy read them their rights with regard to the criminal trespass charges, forced entry, destruction of property, and breaking and entering on a property under active court proceedings. He explained that the district attorney would be in contact regarding the additional matters my attorney had filed. He was calm and thorough. He was the kind of law enforcement presence that makes no speeches and needs none. My father looked at me across the living room of the house my grandfather built. "You set this up, Happer," he said. "I documented what was already true," I said. "You did the rest." Linda said I had no idea what I was doing, that this would destroy the family, that my grandfather would be ashamed of me. I thought about the spring behind the tree line and the stone wall, and the initials carved into the corner post. "He built this house, Meg," I said. "He left it to me. He knew exactly what he was doing." They were escorted to their vehicles. The deputy left a copy of the incident report. Meg closed her binder with a sound like a closing argument. Later, we sat on the porch steps while the motion lights faded back to the regular dark of a November evening in Tennessee. The creak was audible again. The property had gone quiet in the way it does after something has been resolved. My phone buzzed 3 times in an hour. My father, Brooke, Linda. I looked at each notification and I put the phone back in my pocket. "What happens next?" Meg asked. "Tuesday," I said. "Court. Then the title transfers." She nodded. We sat for a while without talking. The cold was the kind that has weight to it, the kind that presses against the windows and tests the seal on the doors. But what is inside stays inside. My grandfather had told me once that land is patient. He said it doesn't go anywhere. It just waits for the right person to show up and stay. I had shown up. I was staying. The next morning, I walked the east boundary and found where my grandfather had left off on the stone wall. The last stone he'd set was still level, still solid, fitted so well into the one beneath it that no winter had shifted it. I picked up the next stone from the pile he'd left beside the fence line. I set it in place. I kept building.